The bond that shouldn't exist. The battlefield was burning. Smoke filled the air. Screams echoed in the distance. Alien ships crashed into the ground. The war between humans and the Draveri, the strongest alien warriors, was almost over. Valera, a proud Draveri warrior, stood alone. Her black armor was broken, her arms bleeding, but her eyes still burned with fire. She had never lost a battle. Until now. Suddenly, a human soldier pointed a weapon at her. She stared into his eyes, waiting for death. She was ready. But he didn't shoot. Instead, he dropped his gun and rushed toward her. "You're hurt," he said. Valera growled. "Don't touch me, human." The man ignored her anger. He pulled her up and carried her toward a broken wall for cover. His name was Eli. He was just a simple human soldier, but something about him was different. Valera's vision blurred. A strange golden light began to shine from the ground beneath them. Eli looked down. "What is this?" A circular ancient device, half buried in the dirt, lit up. Symbols from both alien and human language spun around it. Valera screamed. The device pulled them closer, faster than they could move. The light wrapped around them like chains. Then, everything went black. Valera opened her eyes slowly. She was lying on a soft bed. The room smelled like metal and medicine. Machines beeped softly around her. She tried to sit up, and pain shot through her chest. She looked down. Her skin glowed faintly, golden lines running across her arms. She touched them. They pulsed under her fingers. The door opened. Eli stepped in, holding a tray of food. "You're awake," he said. Valera growled. "Where am I?" "You're on a human ship. You passed out after the bond." "Bond?" she asked. Eli nodded. "That device on the battlefield. It connected us. The doctors say our life forces are now linked." Valera laughed bitterly. "You lie. No Draveri would ever be bonded to a human." "It's true," he said quietly. "If you die, I die. If I get hurt, you feel it too." Valera's eyes narrowed. "This is a curse." "I didn't ask for it either," Eli said. "But now we're stuck." She tried to stand again, but her knees buckled. Eli caught her. She pushed him away. "Don't touch me," she spat. "I'm not your enemy," he said. "Then what are you?" she asked. He didn't answer. The doctors ran more tests. They poked and scanned her. She didn't like it, but the pain was less when Eli was near. She didn't want to admit it, but something about the bond made her feel less alone. Late one night, she stood by the window of her room, looking at the stars. She wondered what her people would think of her now, a bonded traitor. She turned around when she heard a sound. Eli was asleep in the chair near her bed. He was mumbling in his sleep. "Don't leave me, Reyna. Please." Valera froze. Reyna. That name hit her heart like a blade. Reyna was her brother's name, her little brother who died when humans attacked her planet. No one else knew that name. "How?" she whispered. Eli turned in his sleep, a tear rolling down his cheek. Valera stepped closer. Her hand reached out without thinking. Her fingers almost touched his face. She pulled back. Her heart was beating fast. What was happening to her? The next morning, she sat quietly while Eli brought breakfast. He didn't say much. Neither did she. But something had changed. She didn't try to kill him. Not yet. As he left the room, she looked at the glowing mark on her arm. It was still there, still warm. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. She didn't understand this bond. But one thing was clear. It was just the beginning. And whatever came next would change everything. A warrior's shame. Valera sat on the edge of her bed, her sharp alien eyes watching the quiet stars outside the small round window. Her hands were still shaking. She hated that. She was a Draveri, elite, fearless, born to conquer galaxies. Her body was trained for war since childhood. Her heart was forged in fire. But now she felt something she never expected. Weakness. Not from her wounds, not from the strange bond that connected her to the human soldier, but from what she felt inside. Shame. The door opened. Eli walked in with a datapad and 2 mugs of hot liquid. He set one mug near her but didn't get too close. He had learned not to. "I brought you something to drink," he said, his voice gentle. She didn't respond. Her gaze stayed on the stars. "I read that your kind drinks a mix of starroot and fire dust," he added. "The medbot made a version. Kinda." Still nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Right. Of course. You probably hate me." Her eyes snapped to him. "I do." Eli nodded. "Fair enough." He turned and sat in the chair across the room, sipping from his own cup. Silence filled the space between them, but it wasn't a cold silence. It was waiting. Later that day, the ship's medical team entered. 2 human scientists and a translator droid. "We need to run more tests," said the lead scientist. "The bond is reacting to emotional states. It's evolving." Valera growled. "I am not your experiment." "We're not trying to hurt you," Eli said. "We just need to understand it." She stood up slowly, towering over everyone in the room. Even weakened, her presence was terrifying. "If you try to control me," she warned, "I will end you, bond or not." The lights on the machine next to her arm began to flicker. The golden lines across her skin glowed brighter. Everyone stepped back, except Eli. "Valera," he said softly, "just let them do one scan. If anything feels wrong, we stop. I promise." She glared at him, then slowly nodded. The scan began. Something strange happened during the test. As the machine read her body and mind, she felt a sudden sharp pull. Her eyes closed against her will. And then, memories that were not hers flooded in. A boy crying in a ruined village. A man kneeling beside a dying woman, blood on his hands. Fire. Screams. Loneliness. She saw Eli as a child, running through streets filled with ash, calling for his mother. She felt his pain, his loss. Her fists clenched. The machine beeped loudly. The scan stopped. She opened her eyes and looked at Eli. For the first time, she saw him. Not as a soldier, not as an enemy, but as someone broken. She returned to her room that night without a word. She stared at the floor for hours. Why had she seen his memories? Why had the bond shown her something so personal? More importantly, why did it hurt? She should feel nothing for a human, nothing but hate. And yet, that night, a new memory came. But this time, it wasn't Eli's. It was hers. She was a child again, standing beside her brother Reyna, hiding during a raid. He held her hand, whispering the same words Eli had muttered in his sleep. "Don't leave me. You're all I have." She gasped and woke up in a sweat. What was happening to her? The next morning, she sat quietly while Eli brought her food. "You okay?" he asked, setting down the tray. She didn't answer. Instead, she picked up the food and began to eat. It was the first time she had accepted anything from him. He smiled just a little. "You don't have to like me," he said. "I know this bond is weird, painful even, but we're in this together." Valera paused. "Why did you save me?" Eli blinked. "What?" "On the battlefield," she said. "You could have killed me. Why didn't you?" He looked down at his hands. "Because I saw you kneeling, bleeding, alone, and I remembered myself." She stared at him. "No one should die alone," he said. For a long time, Valera said nothing. Then softly, she spoke. "Your kind destroyed my people, burned our cities, took everything." Eli nodded. "I know, and yet you saved me." He looked into her eyes. "Maybe that's how we start to fix things." The next day, the alarm on the ship went off. Security breach. Unauthorized ship approaching. Eli ran toward Valera's room. "We need to move. Someone's coming." Before she could ask who, the lights turned red. The ship shook violently. A loud boom. They were under attack. Valera pushed Eli behind her as the door exploded open. Through the smoke walked a tall figure in silver armor, a long blade in one hand. Valera's eyes widened. Commander Zoran. The Draveri commander, her former mentor, stepped forward. Valera, he said coldly, I came to end this shame. They fought in the hallway, Valera and Zoran, two shadows clashing with deadly speed. Eli tried to help, but the bond struck him with pain every time Valera was hit. She blocked a deadly strike and screamed. Eli dropped to the floor, clutching his side. Valera, stop, please. Zoran turned to Eli. So it's true. You are bound. How pathetic. Valera's voice trembled with rage. He is not weak. Zoran smirked. Then choose. Come with me, and I'll break the bond. I'll give you your honor back. Or stay with him, and be nothing. She hesitated. Eli was on the floor, blood dripping from his mouth. Zoran waited. The silence stretched. Then Valera looked up, her eyes burning bright. No, she said. Zoran raised his sword. I choose him, she whispered. She attacked with new strength, surprising Zoran, knocking him back. He cursed and vanished into a teleport pod, escaping into the stars. Later, in the ship's medbay, Valera sat beside Eli's bed. He opened his eyes slowly. You didn't leave. No, she said. I didn't. Why? He asked, voice weak. She didn't answer at first. Then she spoke. Because I would rather die with you than live without myself. Enemies of both worlds. The air in the medbay was thick with silence. Machines beeped softly. The lights flickered overhead. Eli lay unconscious, pale and still. His chest rose and fell slowly, like the last breath of a dying star. Valera sat beside him, her armored hands clenched on her knees. She had fought in over 50 battles, broken bones, crushed enemies, but never before had her heart shaken like this. She had chosen him, a human, not because she was weak, but because, somehow, in the middle of war, pain, and blood, he had seen her. The ship's captain stood in front of the window, arms behind his back. We're sending him to a safer facility, he said. The council wants answers. You're both under observation now. Valera didn't reply. Her eyes stayed on Eli. You should know, the captain added. Your own people put a bounty on your head. High value. Dead or alive. Valera didn't flinch. Let them come. 3 nights passed. Eli finally woke. He blinked at the ceiling, then turned his head and saw her. You stayed, he whispered. Valera nodded once. He smiled. You're stubborn. You're annoying, she replied. But her voice was softer than ever before. By morning, news had spread. The Draveri wanted Valera back, alive, so she could be executed properly. The humans wanted the bond studied, contained, and possibly erased. Neither side cared that she and Eli were no longer enemies. They were now something worse in the eyes of both. A threat. Eli and Valera sat in the hangar near an old fighter ship that hadn't flown in years. Where would we even go? Eli asked. Somewhere quiet, Valera replied. Somewhere the war doesn't reach. Eli shook his head. There's no such place anymore. She looked at him. Then we make one. He blinked. You'd run. You'd leave your honor behind. Valera's jaw tightened. Honor means nothing if the people behind it forget mercy. Eli stared at her, surprised. Then he stood. All right. Then let's disappear. That night, under cover of darkness, they stole the ship. The engines roared to life as they lifted off from the medical vessel, alarms blaring behind them. Unauthorized launch detected. Repeat. Unauthorized. They jumped to hyperspeed before anyone could lock weapons. Inside the ship, Eli collapsed in the pilot's seat, laughing. We actually did it. Valera raised an eyebrow. This was your plan? No, he admitted. I didn't think we'd survive this long. She leaned back in her seat. You still might not. The ship drifted into deep space. A week passed. They traveled from moon to moon, planet to planet. Valera used old Draveri codes to hide them. Ela traded spare parts for supplies. They were not friends. Not yet. But they weren't enemies anymore either. Sometimes they sat in silence for hours. No words, just the sound of engines humming. Sometimes they argued over food. Sometimes they shared stories of home, though they didn't call it that. Not yet. On the 10th day, their bond pulsed. Not in pain this time, but in mourning. Valera looked up from her seat. They found us. Eli spun the ship. How? Draveri hunters, she said. They have bond seekers. They can feel when a warrior changes. 2 dark ships appeared behind them. Sleek, silent, deadly. Run, Eli asked. Valera shook her head. They're faster. What then? She stood, armor locking into place. We fight. The enemy ships fired. Eli dodged, barely. Valera launched herself out the side hatch in a suit built for battle. She flew across the void, her blade glowing bright against the stars. She landed on the enemy vessel and sliced through its hull like paper. Sparks flew. The ship spiraled. Inside their own ship, Eli felt her pain again, sharp, sudden, like knives in his side. But he didn't pass out this time. He fought through it. Valera returned, bleeding but alive. Eli caught her as she stumbled through the airlock. You're insane, he said, half smiling. You're slow, she replied. But the glow between them pulsed stronger now, like a heart that refused to die. They found a small mining station on a cold planet. Old, abandoned, forgotten by both empires. It became their new home. For now. They repaired the walls, started a garden, shared meals in silence. Valera trained in the mornings. Eli fixed broken machines. Time passed differently here. Slower, safer. They didn't talk about the war or the bond, but they felt it every day, every hour. The connection between them was no longer pain. It had become comfort. One night, Eli sat outside on a rock, staring at the stars. Valera joined him, wearing a loose cloak instead of armor. You know, he said, I used to hate the stars. She looked at him. Why? Because they were full of enemies, he said. Now, I look at them and think of you. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, Do you still hate me? Eli turned to her, surprised. No, not even a little. Even after everything, she asked. He shook his head. You saved my life. You protected me. You stayed. She looked down. I don't know what I'm becoming. He touched her hand, just lightly. Something better, he said. Suddenly, alarms rang from inside the base. They both jumped up. A signal, unmistakable. Tracked. Located. Their faces turned grim. Enemies were coming again. But this time, not just Draveri, not just humans. Both. Together. Valera stood, her eyes fierce again. They want to destroy what they can't understand. Eli nodded. Then we don't give them the chance. They began to prepare. Not to run, but to fight. Together. The decision. Snow drifted across the silent mining outpost like ghosts from a forgotten time. The cold wind whispered through broken vents and quiet halls, but inside the shelter, deep beneath layers of ice and stone, 2 hearts beat with the same rhythm. Valera stood in the center of the base, tightening the straps on her armor. She no longer wore it for war. She wore it for him. Behind her, Eli was checking the shield generators. His face was calm, but his hand shook slightly. 3 ships, he said. They'll be here in less than 2 hours. Valera didn't respond. She stared at the old sword resting on the table, her people's blade, gifted only to generals. Once, it was her pride. Now, it felt heavier than ever. They sat across from each other in the command room, the dim lights flickering above. "I heard the signal," Eli said. It wasn't just Draveri or humans this time. It was both. "They've joined forces," Valera replied. "To kill us. To erase us," she said. "They can't let a bond like this survive. It breaks every law." Eli looked at her for a long time. "Do you want to run?" Valera closed her eyes. "I want to be free." Suddenly, the comms crackled to life. A deep, cold voice filled the room. "This is Commander Trask of the United Human Draveri Alliance. We have you surrounded. Surrender the bonded pair. We promise a clean separation. No pain. No war." Eli stared at the console. "Do you think they're lying?" Valera stepped closer. "They're offering to break the bond." "Can they do it?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, the bond was made through ancient tech. It can be undone." But what?" She met his eyes. "If they break it, we will forget." "Forget?" "Everything," she said. "The memories, the connection. We'll be strangers again." Eli took a step back. "You mean, I wouldn't even remember your face?" "No," she said quietly. "And I wouldn't remember yours." He shook his head. "That's not freedom. That's erasing what we became." Valera turned away. "It would save our lives. At what cost?" he asked. They spent the next hour in silence. Outside, the ships circled like wolves in the dark. Inside, the air grew heavy. Finally, Eli stood and walked toward the exit. "I need air." Valera didn't stop him. She stared at the blade again. Her honor, her shame, her choice. Eli sat near the frozen edge of the landing platform, watching the sky burn faint orange from enemy engines above. He thought about Earth. He thought about the war. He thought about her. Not as a soldier, not even as a warrior. Just Valera. Strong, proud, stubborn, brave, and yet, somehow, gentle in the way she looked at the stars. A quiet voice behind him broke the stillness. "If we let them break it, you could go home." He turned. Valera stood beside him, arms crossed, her eyes on the horizon. "You could have a life," she said. "A normal one." Eli smiled sadly. "I haven't been normal since the day I met you." She sat beside him. The snow crunched under her armor. "The bond changed us," she said. "But I think maybe I was already changing." He nodded. "Me too." They looked at each other. No war, no weapons, just two souls, connected. Eli asked softly, "Do you want to forget me?" Valera didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I want to stop hurting." "But if you forget," he said, "you'll never remember why you stopped." She smiled just a little. "That's the most human thing I've ever heard." Suddenly, the base shook. A red light flashed on the nearest wall. Landing confirmed. Hostiles entering perimeter. They both stood, instantly alert. It was time. They returned to the command room. Trask's voice echoed again. "This is your final chance. Surrender. Step outside. We will do the rest." Valera looked at Eli. Eli looked at Valera. The moment had come. They could walk outside, give themselves up, and lose everything. Or they could fight, and maybe die. Together. "I won't let them take what we've become," Eli said, "even if it kills me." Valera reached out, placing her hand over his. "Then we die as one." They sealed the doors, powered the last defense turret, and waited. The first explosion shook the walls. The second cracked the ceiling. They fought side by side. Eli with a plasma rifle, Valera with her blade. She moved like fire, striking with speed and grace. He backed her up, covering her blind spots. They didn't speak, but they didn't have to. The bond told them everything. Where to move, when to duck, when to protect, when to trust. But there were too many. They were pushed back, room by room. Finally, cornered in the heart of the base, Valera was hit. She dropped to one knee. Eli screamed, grabbing her, dragging her behind cover. "I've got you," he whispered. Blood ran from her mouth. "The bond is weakening," she said. He looked at her, really looked, and saw her fear. Not of death, but of losing him. He pulled a small device from his belt, a glowing crystal from the original bond site. "The ancient tech," he said. "We can use it again." "To do what?" she asked. "To end this, or become something more." Valera's eyes widened. "If we do this, we will never be the same." Eli nodded. "Good." They joined hands. The crystal pulsed. The bond ignited like a second sun, flooding the room in golden light. Enemy soldiers screamed and dropped their weapons, shielding their eyes. When the light faded, they were gone. The base lay silent, burning, broken, but no bodies were found. Only a mark scorched into the floor, 2 hands fused in glowing stone. Legends began to spread, of a human and a Draveri who defied war, of a bond so strong it became something else. Not enemy, not lover, not even friends, but a new being, a bridge between worlds. And far, far away, on a quiet planet no map could find, 2 figures sat under a blue sky, laughing, breathing, living. Human feelings, alien heart. The world they landed on had no name, no cities, no war, no maps. Just tall silver trees that hummed in the wind, glowing lakes that reflected stars even during the day, and a sky that turned from gold to violet as the sun crossed it slowly. Eli called it haven. Valera said nothing at first, but when she looked at the sky with her sharp eyes, something in her chest softened. She didn't hate it. They built a shelter from parts of the ship, simple, quiet, warm. Eli created solar panels and basic lights. Valera hunted with handmade weapons and slept with one eye open. The bond between them had changed again. It no longer burned or screamed. It pulsed, gently, like a quiet drumbeat deep inside their skin. But there was something else now. Something strange. Whispers. Not voices from outside. Voices from within. One night, Eli sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. Valera sat across from him, sharpening a blade. He asked, "Do you ever feel like we're not alone?" She paused. "In the forest?" "No," he said. "In our minds." Valera's face grew still. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes I hear laughter, or crying, or names I've never known." He nodded slowly. "I dreamed about a mountain yesterday. I've never seen it before, but it felt like home. I dreamed I was standing in water," she said, "with stars above and fire below." They looked at each other. "What is this bond doing to us?" Eli whispered. Days passed. The trees began to whisper too, not with words, but with a kind of music. It made the air shimmer. The lakes would sometimes glow when they walked near, reflecting not just their faces, but flashes of the past. Valera once saw her brother. Eli once saw his mother, but neither of them spoke of it. They were both warriors, trained to survive, but nothing had prepared them for feelings. One day, Eli brought her a gift. It was a bracelet, twisted metal, with a shard of the old bond crystal set in the center. "I made it for you," he said. Valera held it in her hand. It felt warm. "You think I need decorations?" "No," he said. "I think you deserve something beautiful." Valera stared at him for a long time. She put the bracelet on and said nothing, but her silence was not rejection. It was unfamiliar warmth. That night, the whispers grew louder. Valera stood by the lake, her body still, her eyes closed. She felt something rising inside her chest, a memory not hers, a field of white flowers, a human child running, a Draveri watching from the shadows, smiling. She gasped and opened her eyes. Eli. He ran toward her. I saw something, she said, but it wasn't mine. It was ancient. Eli looked shaken. I saw it too. They stared at each other. What if this bond didn't begin with us? He asked. Valera looked up at the sky. Then who started it? The next morning, they followed the music in the trees. They walked for hours through silver forests and glowing moss until they reached a canyon. At the bottom was a structure, part stone, part crystal, grown into the rock like roots. Eli whispered, "That's not human." Valera nodded, "And it's not Draveri either." They climbed down. Inside, the walls were covered in carvings, images of humans and aliens standing side by side, bonded. Eli stepped closer. This happened before. Valera placed her hand on one of the carvings. It glowed beneath her touch. Suddenly, light burst from the floor. They were pulled into a vision, a place beyond time. They saw a galaxy in balance, humans and Draveri, once allies, joined through bonds created by an ancient order known only as the Heartweavers. But the bonds were feared. Feared because they made enemies understand each other. Feared because they erased the lies that fueled war. So the Heartweavers were hunted, erased from history, but not completely. Some left behind traces, crystals, devices, echoes, waiting for two souls to find each other again. The vision ended. Eli fell to his knees, breathing hard. Valera leaned against the wall, her face pale. "It's not just us," she whispered. "We're reborn." Eli looked up. "No wonder they want to destroy us. We are proof that peace is possible," she said. "And they fear that more than any weapon." They walked back to Haven in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because their hearts were full. Something ancient had awakened, and now the galaxy would come looking again. That night, as the fire burned low, Eli sat beside her and asked, "Do you still hate humans?" Valera looked at the stars. "No," she said. "I understand them now." He nodded. "And you?" she asked. "Do you still fear Draveri?" Eli smiled. "Only when they're mad." She almost smiled too. Almost. Later, as the wind howled outside, she came to his room. Not with armor. Not with weapons. Just her. She stood in the doorway. And for the first time, asked, "Can I stay?" He moved aside, said nothing, but held out his hand. She took it, and the bond between them pulsed, stronger than it had ever been. Not in pain, not in fear, but in understanding, in trust, in something neither of them could say yet, but both were beginning to feel. Far away, in the deepest corners of space, machines stirred, eyes opened, signals were sent. The galaxy had felt the bond awaken again. The Heartweaver's secret was no longer hidden. War would come again, but this time, two hearts would face it, together. The storm within. The rain had never come to Haven before. Now it fell hard and heavy. Thick drops poured from the violet sky, soaking the silver forest, beating against the shelter like fists. Eli stood outside, face to the sky, his hands open. He had never felt rain on this world. It was colder than he imagined, wilder. It felt like a warning. Inside the shelter, Valera sat by the fire, her hands shaking. Not from fear, but from something worse. Something she couldn't name. For days now, the bond had pulsed unevenly, wild bursts of energy, flashes of memory, thoughts that were not her own. She heard Eli's voice in her dreams before he spoke. She saw shadows of her own face reflected in his memories. Sometimes she could even feel his heartbeat inside her chest. Something was changing, not just between them, within them. That night, she woke up screaming. Eli rushed in. What happened? She was shaking, pale, eyes wide. I saw it again, she whispered. The galaxy, burning. And you, standing in the middle, covered in light, but alone. Eli knelt beside her. It was just a dream. No, she said, grabbing his arm. It was a vision. It's coming. Eli stared at her, fear creeping into his voice. Coming. What is? She looked at him with hollow eyes. The end. The next day, the skies turned red, and the beacon lit up again. They had buried it weeks ago, deep beneath the soil, inside layers of shielding metal, but now it pulsed with a sickly green light. They were no longer hidden. They found us, Eli said, staring at the light. Again. Valora stood beside him, gripping her blade. But this signal, it's different. How? It's not the Alliance, she said. It's him. Eli's blood ran cold. Zarin. That night, the clouds split with thunder, and from the sky, a single ship descended. Not an army, just one. Sleek, black, silent. It landed near the lake, and waited. Valor stepped out alone. Her armor gleamed wet with rain. Eli stood at the doorway, his rifle ready, but she had told him not to follow. I have to face him, she said. He'll kill you, Eli had replied. No, she said, eyes dark. He wants something worse. Zarin stepped from the ship. Still tall, still strong, still the same cold fire in his eyes. But now he wore no helmet, no army, just a cloak made from Traveri steel. He looked at her with something close to sorrow. You survived, he said. She didn't speak. He stepped closer, and the bond has grown. Still, she said nothing. I came to offer peace, he said. Valra laughed. You? Peace? I mean it, he said. The council saw what you did, what you became. They fear you, but they also see opportunity. Valera narrowed her eyes. What kind of opportunity? He stepped closer. They want to weaponize the bond. She froze. They've already begun research, Zarin said. Human Traveri pairs, forced into connection. But it never works. The others go mad, or die. Valera's voice was ice. Because the bond isn't made by force. Zarin nodded. Exactly. But you and your human, you are different. Natural. You are the key. She stepped back. No. They will find you, he said. If not me, then someone worse. Why are you here? She asked. Really? Zarin looked away. Because I was bonded once. Long ago. Her breath caught. He turned his wrist. A faint scar glowed blue beneath the skin. She died, he said. The pain never left. Valera's voice cracked. I didn't know. Of course not, he said. They erased all records. But I came to offer you a choice. What choice? Surrender yourself. Let the council study you. Share your secrets. Or, he looked into her eyes. I destroy you now, before they turn you into a god. She returned to the shelter without a word. Rain still poured. Eli met her at the door. What did he say? Valera stared at him. They want to turn us into weapons. Eli frowned. And Zarin? He gave me a choice. Betray the bond, or let him kill us before they use us. Eli stepped closer. And what do you want? Valera hesitated. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, her voice cracked with something like pain. I don't know anymore. The next few days passed in silence. The rain never stopped. The bond grew hotter, burning them from the inside. Eli would walk outside and feel her fear in his chest. Valera would close her eyes and hear his thoughts. It was too much, too deep, too fast. They couldn't breathe. One night, Eli slammed his fist against the wall. "I can't do this," he shouted. "I don't even know who I am anymore." Valora stood still. "Neither do I." He turned. "Then why stay? Why not end it?" She stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "I tried," she said. "I tried to shut it off, to forget you, to be the warrior I was before. But every time I close my eyes, I feel you," he whispered. "And every time I bleed, I feel you pulling me back." They stared at each other, not as soldier and alien, not as enemies, but as something else, something new, something terrifying. The bond pulsed violently. Energy burst from their skin, glowing across the room. The walls cracked. The ground trembled. Their bodies shook. And then, everything went still. They awoke on the floor, side by side, breathing hard. But something had changed. The pain was gone. The noise was gone. The connection remained, but now it was quiet, clear, calm, like a river that had stopped fighting the rocks. They sat outside that morning as the storm finally passed. Sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. Eli held her hand. Valora didn't pull away. He asked, "Do you still want to run?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." He smiled. "Me neither." She looked up, but her smile faded. "Then we fight," she said, "for each other." Far above them, in a dark room orbiting a dead star, 100 eyes watched. "Prepare the fleet," a voice said. "The bonded pair has awakened their final form." And somewhere deep inside a hidden vault, another crystal pulsed, waiting. The Defiance. The stars were no longer silent. Ships moved like shadows across the galaxy. Fleets gathered near black suns. War engines spun in orbit, waiting for a command. In every corner of known space, two names passed in whispers: Eli, Valora, the bonded ones, the traitors, the hopeful, the unknown. Everyone had a story about them. Some said they were dead. Others said they were gods. But the truth was simple. They were alive, and they were done hiding. Haven bloomed beneath their feet. The planet had begun to change. The land itself responded to their bond. Trees grew faster. The air felt warmer. The lakes shimmered with light from beneath the surface, reflecting not just stars, but visions. Eli stood at the cliff's edge, watching the sun rise, its twin rays painting the sky gold and blue. Valora joined him silently. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked. She nodded. "Something is coming. Something big." They looked at each other, and without speaking, they'd made the decision. No more running, no more hiding. They would stand together. They returned to the crystal vault, the one beneath the ancient canyon where the Heartweaver's history had first found them. It pulsed brighter now, the carvings glowing with lines that danced and shifted as if alive. "We need to finish the bond," Valora said. "Complete it." Eli stared at the symbols. "What happens if we do?" "We stop being human," she said. "Stop being Dravari." "Then what are we?" She looked into his eyes. New. They placed their hands on the crystal. A light brighter than anything they'd ever seen swallowed them whole. They didn't scream. They didn't fall. They rose. Their bodies lifted into the air as energy rushed through them. Their veins glowed with threads of gold and blue. Their minds exploded with vision after vision. Lives they never lived, voices they'd never heard, languages they never learned, but somehow remembered. They saw the first bond. Two beings, one human, one Dravari, facing death, choosing connection instead of destruction. They saw how that choice shaped an ancient peace, how the empires feared it, crushed it, erased it from history. But they also saw that it never truly died. It waited for them. When the light faded, they stood side by side. Changed. Valora's armor shimmered like liquid crystal, forged from her will. Her eyes glowed not red, not blue, but both. She no longer felt just her heartbeat. She felt his inside her chest. Eli's body was stronger, quicker, his senses sharper. But it wasn't just physical. He could hear her thoughts as if they were his own, not like reading a mind. More like understanding the soul. They stepped outside, and the sky split open. The fleet came not in silence, but with sound. Massive ships dropped through the clouds like falling gods, weapons armed, lights blinking in endless rows. Their engines burned like fire. "Attention," came the broadcast from orbit. "You are outlaws of the Grand Accord. You will surrender or be eliminated." Eli took a deep breath. No. The ships moved into formation. Valora stepped forward, sword on her back, her hands glowing with power. "Then we defy you," she said. The battle began with thunder. Hundreds of drones rained from the sky. Missiles tore through the trees. The forest burned. But Eli and Valora did not fall. They moved together like twin stars colliding, his rifle glowing with plasma, her blade slicing through air and steel. They didn't need words anymore. When Eli ducked, Valora blocked. When Valora turned, Eli struck. They were faster, smarter, stronger. The bond had made them something more. The enemy unleashed everything. Tanks, bombers, mechs with minds of their own. Still they fought. Still they stood, until the ground cracked beneath them, and the sky tore open one last time. A final ship descended, larger than the others, black as death. From its side, a figure stepped out. Zarin. Again. But changed. His body fused with machines, his eyes replaced with red lenses, his voice no longer his own. "You had your chance," he said. "Now, you die." Valora stepped forward. "I mourned you once," she said. "I buried the man I respected." "You should have stayed dead with him," Zarin growled. He launched himself forward, faster than before, powered by cybernetic rage. Valora blocked his first strike, but staggered under the second. Eli fired, but Zarin's armor absorbed it. They'd fought across the burning forest, blades clashing, trees falling. The earth trembled beneath them. Zarin slammed Valora into the dirt. "You're not Dravari anymore," he hissed. "And you're not anything," she spat. He raised his blade. And that's when Eli screamed her name. She rolled aside just in time. Zarin turned to strike Eli, but froze. Because behind Eli, the bond crystal floated in the air, glowing like a second sun. It pulsed once, and everything stopped. Time slowed. The wind held its breath. And the bond, the pure force that connected them, poured outward like a wave of light. It struck Zarin. He staggered, dropped his blade, fell to his knees, and whispered, "I remember." His eyes flickered. Images of his lost bond, the woman he once loved, flashed in his mind. And then, he was gone. Not dead, just silent. The battle ended in silence. The fleet retreated. No order was given. They simply left. The soldiers who watched from orbit had seen too much. Not war, not destruction, but something holy. Months passed, then years. The bond became legend. No one knew where Eli and Valora went. Some said they vanished into light. Others claimed they walked the stars, healing what war had broken. But one thing was certain. The galaxy was not the same. Because now, everyone knew the truth. Connection was possible. Peace was possible. Love, even across galaxies, was real. On a distant world with no name, two figures walked through silver grass, hand in hand. They didn't wear armor anymore. They didn't carry weapons. They didn't need to. Because they were more than human, more than Dravari. They were bonded. Two souls, one life, forever.